It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Marcus Sterling laughed as he tipped his crystal flute, letting the vintage Krug splash across Cassandra Thorne's modest charcoal blazer in front of the entire charity gala committee. The pale gold liquid bloomed like a bruise against the fabric, cold and sharp. For a moment, the heavy scent of Casablanca lilies in the Thorne ballroom seemed to vanish, replaced by the yeasty sting of wasted champagne. "Oh, Cassandra," Marcus said, his voice carrying perfectly to the group of donors standing nearby. He didn't look sorry, he looked invigorated. "I suppose I forgot you were standing there. You're so quiet, one almost mistakes you for the furniture. Perhaps if you wore something that didn't look like it was plucked from a mid-level government liquidation sale, you'd be harder to miss." A few of the committee members chuckled, a dry, polite sound that felt like a slap. Cassandra didn't flinch. She felt the dampness seeping through her blouse, the chill of it clinging to her skin, but her hands remained steady at her sides. She didn't wipe the wine away. She simply looked at him, her gaze tracing the sharp, expensive lines of his custom-tailored tuxedo. "It's an easy mistake to make, Marcus," she replied, her voice low and perfectly level. "Some people focus on the shine. Others focus on the structure. Structure is for people who can't afford the shine," he sneered, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to maintain the illusion of intimacy while ensuring the witnesses could still catch the venom. "Do yourself a favor and head to the kitchen. Maybe Mrs. Gable can find you a rag. You're depressing the donors." Beatrice Thorne drifted over then, her silk gown shimmering like oil on water. She glanced at the stain on her sister's chest and then up at Marcus, her expression one of mild, elegant distaste, not for Marcus's behavior, but for Cassandra's presence. "Honestly, Cass," Beatrice sighed, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. "Marcus is right. You look a fright. This is the Thorne Foundation's biggest night of the year, and you're standing here dripping like a broken pipe. Go change. Or better yet, just stay in the library. You've always been better with the books than the people anyway." "She was just leaving, Beatrice," Arthur Thorne added, his booming baritone cutting through the air as he joined the circle. The patriarch of the family didn't even look at his youngest daughter. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, his hand landing on the younger man's shoulder with a proprietary pride. "Marcus was just telling me about the new offshore equity play he's finalized for the family trust. High-level stuff, Cassandra, beyond the scope of your little auditing firm." "I'm sure it is, Father," Cassandra said. She saw the way Marcus's chest expanded at the praise, the way his eyes darted momentarily to the side. A micro-expression of relief that only someone trained to hunt for financial discrepancies would catch. Marcus had been managing the Thorne family's primary investment portfolio for 18 months. In that time, he had become the golden boy, the alpha that Arthur had always wanted for a son. He was the man who had swept Beatrice off her feet and convinced the family that their traditional, conservative wealth needed his modern, aggressive touch. Cassandra turned away without another word, the squelch of her damp heels on the polished marble the only sound she made. She felt their eyes on her back, the pity, the mockery, and the dismissive boredom of people who thought they had already won. She didn't go to the kitchen. She bypassed the main staircase and slipped into the darkened sanctuary of the West Wing Library. The rooms smelled of old paper and beeswax. It was the only place in the estate that still felt like it belonged to her. Closing the door, she finally pulled a silk handkerchief from her pocket and began to dab at the blazer. Her movements were clinical. She wasn't thinking about the ruined wool or the public humiliation. She was thinking about the brochure Marcus had left on the library table earlier that afternoon, a prospectus for a Blue Water acquisition that he claimed was the centerpiece of the family's new growth strategy. She walked to the desk and pulled a slim, encrypted laptop from a hidden drawer. Her fingers flew across the keys, the glow of the screen reflecting in her dark eyes. "Leo, are you there?" she whispered into a headset she pulled from the drawer. "Always, Cass," Leo Vance's voice crackled in her ear, crisp and professional. "How's the party? Did Marcus do the thing?" "He did the thing," she said, glancing down at the champagne stain. "He's moved beyond simple arrogance into total recklessness. He's so sure he's untouchable that he's stopped covering the digital trail of the shell companies. He thinks my father's name is a shield. And is it?" "It's a target," Cassandra corrected. She opened a file that displayed a series of wire transfers. They were complex, layered through 4 different jurisdictions, but the underlying math was flawed. Marcus was brilliant at the pitch, but he was lazy with the ledger. He was skimming, not just a little, but millions. He was cannibalizing the Thorne legacy to fund a lifestyle that Arthur and Beatrice assumed was the fruit of his genius. "I need the signature verification on the Cayman accounts," she said, her voice turning cold. "The ones linked to the Vanguard holdings he mentioned to my father tonight." "Already on it," Leo replied. "Cass, if you pull this thread, the whole house of cards doesn't just fall. It implodes. Your father, Beatrice. They're all tied to those filings." Cassandra looked at the closed library door. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of the orchestra playing in the ballroom, the laughter of the people who had watched her be humiliated and done nothing. She thought of Marcus's smirk as the wine hit her skin. "They chose the shine over the structure, Leo," she said, her eyes narrowing as a specific document flashed onto her screen, a forged signature that bore her father's name, but lacked the distinct tremor Arthur had developed in his right hand over the last year. "Marcus Sterling thinks he's playing with a mouse. He's forgotten that I'm the one who taught him how to read a balance sheet." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, high-capacity flash drive. She plugged it in, watching the progress bar as it began to suck the life out of Marcus's digital empire. "How long until the final audit is ready?" she asked. 2 days, Leo said, just in time for the anniversary board meeting. Cassandra felt a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She touched the damp spot on her blazer one last time. It was cold, but the fire in her chest was finally beginning to burn. "Perfect," she whispered. "Let him have his champagne tonight. In 48 hours, he won't even be able to afford the glass." The next morning, the scent of expensive Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee drifted through the sun-drenched breakfast room of Thorne Manor. Cassandra stepped onto the polished herringbone floors, her footsteps silent compared to the aggressive clink of silver against bone china coming from the head of the table. Marcus Sterling sat in her father's usual chair, draped in a charcoal silk robe that probably cost more than a teacher's annual salary. He didn't look up from his tablet as she approached, but his smirk was visible even from the side. Arthur Thorne sat to his right, beaming with the kind of pride he had never once directed toward his own daughter. "Ah, Cassandra, finally join the living," Arthur said, his voice booming with forced joviality. He adjusted his gold spectacles, looking her over with a faint air of disappointment. "Marcus was just showing me the projected returns on the offshore diversification. Brilliant work, truly. He saved the family legacy from the stagnation of the last decade." Beatrice Thorne sat across from them, delicately peeling a blood orange. She didn't look up, her focus entirely on her fruit. "It's about time someone took the reins, Dad. Some of us were starting to worry the Thorne name was becoming synonymous with boring stability instead of growth." "Stability is just another word for standing still," Marcus added, finally setting his tablet down. He leaned back, his eyes raking over Cassandra's simple navy blazer and tailored trousers. "Speaking of standing still, Cass, I noticed you were burning the midnight oil in the study last night. Still playing with those dusty spreadsheets. You know, if you're struggling with your little auditing firm's taxes, I could have one of my junior associates take a look." "It's charity work, really, but for family, I'd make an exception." Cassandra felt the familiar heat of a rage spike tighten her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She pulled out a chair, the heavy oak scraping softly against the marble rug. "That's very generous of you, Marcus, but I think I have a handle on the numbers. They're surprisingly transparent once you know where to look." Marcus's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed a fraction. "Transparency is overrated. Results are what matter, which is why Arthur and I have reached a decision." He glanced at the patriarch, who nodded firmly. We're consolidating the family office. All accounts, all trusts, and all physical records are being moved to my firm's private server by the end of the day, including the archives you've been organizing in the study. You're evicting me from my own office, Cassandra asked, her voice level. It's not an eviction, dear, Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It's optimization. Marcus needs the space for a real team. People who actually understand high-frequency trading, not just whatever it is you do with your magnifying glass. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound of a man who had already closed the case. The board meeting is tomorrow, Cassandra. The anniversary gala is the perfect time to announce the new direction. Marcus is the future of this family. You should be grateful he's willing to shoulder the burden. Under the table, Cassandra's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know what it was. Leo Vance had promised a status update on the forensic trail by 8:00 a.m. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the screen. I see, she said, picking up a linen napkin. The anniversary board meeting, 24 hours from now. Exactly, Marcus said, standing up. He walked around the table, stopping just behind her chair. He leaned down, the scent of his cloying, expensive cologne filling her personal space. So, why don't you be a good girl and clear your things out by noon? I'd hate to have Mrs. Gable box them up and put them in the garage. Some of those old ledgers look quite flammable. He patted her shoulder, a heavy, patronizing gesture, and walked out of the room, Arthur following him like a loyal hound. Cassandra waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before pulling out her phone. The message from Leo was short. The Cayman accounts are linked. The diversification Marcus showed your father is a mirror trick. He's not investing the money, Cass. He's hemorrhaging it into a private holding company in his own name. We have the wire transfers. She looked at Beatrice, who was still focused on her orange, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath her feet was already beginning to dissolve. 24 hours, Cassandra whispered to the empty room. She stood up, her chair clicking back into place with a sound like a hammer falling on a nail. She didn't need the study anymore. She had everything she needed right in the palm of her hand, and Marcus Sterling had just handed her the perfect stage for his own funeral. 2 hours after the study door had clicked shut, Cassandra Thorne sat in the back corner of a dim, wood-paneled bar 3 blocks from the estate. The air here smelled of spilled rye and old leather, a sharp contrast to the cloying lilies that filled her father's house. She stared at the man sitting across from her, whose fingers were flying across a matte black laptop. Leo Vance didn't look like a high-level tech investigator. He looked like a graduate student who hadn't slept since the turn of the decade. He paused, his glasses reflecting the blue light of a spreadsheet that contained Marcus Sterling's entire digital soul. He slid a thick, manila envelope across the sticky table. It's worse than the text suggested, Cass, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. He isn't just skimming. He's been using your father's signature to guarantee personal loans for his own failing tech startups. If those companies go under, and they will, the Thorne estate is the collateral. He's literally betting your family's roof on his own incompetence. She opened the envelope. The paper felt heavy, the ink of the wire transfers still smelling faintly of a high-end laser printer. She traced the numbers with a steady finger. Millions of dollars, funneled through a labyrinth of accounts, only to land in a private holding company registered in the Caymans under a name she recognized instantly. The Sterling Group. He's not even trying to hide it from someone who knows where to look, she said, her voice like a blade being drawn from a sheath. He thinks no one is looking, Leo replied. He thinks you're the quiet daughter who does taxes for local bakeries. He's scheduled the final transfer for tomorrow night, during the Founders' Gala. Cassandra felt the weight of the secret power in her hands. She tucked the folder into her bag, the sharp corners of the documents pressing against her hip. Then, I'll make sure he has a very attentive audience for his grand finale. She left the bar and drove toward the Gilded Lily, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, where she knew her family would be holding their nightly court. She arrived just as the main course was being served. The dining room was a sea of crystal and white linen, the sound of silver clinking against porcelain creating a rhythmic, elitist heartbeat. Marcus was at the head of the table, naturally. He was mid-laugh, his signet ring catching the light as he gestured with a glass of vintage Bordeaux. Auditor Thorne sat to his right, looking at the younger man with a pride he had never once directed toward his own daughter. Beatrice was on the left, picking at a salad and laughing at Marcus's jokes with a practiced, hollow enthusiasm. "Ah, the prodigal daughter returns," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, drawing the eyes of 3 nearby tables. He didn't stand, he didn't even pause his meal. "We thought you'd gone to bed to cry over your spreadsheets, Cassandra. You look a bit disheveled. Is the stress of your little auditing job finally getting to you?" Auditor chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Leave her be, Marcus. Some people are built for the boardroom and others are built for the back office. It's a matter of temperament." Cassandra took her seat, the heavy linen napkin feeling like a lead weight in her lap. She caught the scent of Marcus's cologne, a heavy, expensive cedarwood that seemed to colonize the air around him. "I'm perfectly fine, Father," she said, her voice calm and level. "I just had some last-minute business to settle before the gala tomorrow." Marcus smirked, leaning forward until he was well within her personal space. He reached out and flicked a stray hair from her shoulder with a gesture so patronizing it made the blood in her veins turn to ice. "Business? That's adorable. Tell me, does your business involve anything with more than 4 zeros? Because I was just telling your father that we should probably put you on a fixed allowance. You clearly don't have the stomach for the kind of high-stakes aggression the Thorne legacy requires." "An allowance?" Beatrice chimed in, her voice tinkling like broken glass. "Oh, that would be so much easier for you, Cass. You wouldn't have to worry your head about the big numbers anymore." Cassandra looked at Marcus, really looked at him. She saw the sweat beginning to bead at his hairline, hidden by his carefully styled hair. She saw the way his hand gripped his wine glass just a fraction too tight. He was terrified, and he was masking it with a layer of entitlement so thick it was almost physical. "I think you'd be surprised at what I have the stomach for, Marcus," she said. She reached into her bag, her hand brushing the folder Leo had given her. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. "In fact, I've spent the evening looking at some very aggressive figures." Marcus's smirk faltered for a millisecond before hardening back into a mask of contempt. "I'm sure you have, but let's leave the grown-up talk for tomorrow. Auditor, I've already contacted the board. We're moving the foundation's liquid assets into the new, diversified portfolio first thing Monday morning. It's time we stopped playing it safe." Auditor nodded, raising his glass. "To the future of the Thorne name, and to the man smart enough to secure it." Cassandra watched them clink glasses, the sound of the crystal ringing through the room like a funeral bell. She looked at her father, who was toasting the man currently picking his pockets, and then at Marcus, who was already looking around the room to see who was watching his triumph. "Tomorrow will be a very illuminating day for the Thorne name," Cassandra said, her voice a whisper that only Marcus heard. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the waiter jump. "It certainly will be, Cassandra. Try not to wear something too depressing. It's a celebration, after all." She stood up, leaving her meal untouched. She had 24 hours left, and as she walked out of the restaurant, she didn't feel the weight of the injustice anymore. She felt the cold, hard certainty of a trap that was about to spring. Marcus Sterling was standing on a pedestal of his own making, and he had no idea that Cassandra had already begun to saw through the base. The morning of the Thorne Foundation Gala arrived with a deceptive, golden stillness. Cassandra sat in the library, the heavy scent of lilies, Arthur's favorite, filling the room like a funeral parlor. She wasn't mourning, though. Her fingers traced the edge of a silver tablet, the screen glowing with a final, encrypted confirmation from Leo Vance. The digital payload was tethered to the gala's presentation server, a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Still hiding in the shadows, Cassandra." Marcus Sterling stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking under his polished Italian loafers. He looked insufferably pleased with himself, adjusting a silk bow tie that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He simply draped himself over a velvet armchair, smelling of cloying sandalwood and unearned victory. "I'm just enjoying the quiet before the storm," she replied, her voice as smooth as the glass in her hand. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the tablet. He let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "A storm? The only thing happening tonight is my coronation. Your father is handing me the keys to the kingdom, and Beatrice is already planning the merger celebration." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a mock-sympathetic glint. "I've been thinking, though. Once the Thorne name is officially under my management, I might have a spot for you. My junior assistant needs someone to handle the filing. It would keep you off the streets." Cassandra finally looked at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't show the white-hot rage that flickered in her chest at his casual dismissal of her entire life's work. Instead, she offered a thin, enigmatic smile. "That's very generous of you, Marcus, but you should be careful. Foundations built on sand always shift when the tide comes in. You might find your pedestal is a lot shorter than you think." He scoffed, standing up to check his reflection in the gilded mirror above the fireplace. "Cryptic to the end. That's why nobody listens to you, Cassandra. You're all omens and no action." The door opened, and Arthur Thorne walked in, followed closely by Beatrice. Her sister was draped in pearls, her face tight with the stress of maintaining a perfect image. Arthur didn't even look toward the corner where Cassandra sat. His eyes were only for the man he had chosen to be his successor. "Marcus, the car is waiting," Arthur said, his voice booming with the authority he loved to wield. He paused, finally glancing at his daughter with a look of profound disappointment. "Cassandra, try to wear something unobtrusive tonight. I don't want any of your moods distracting the investors. This is a night for alpha moves, not forensic accounting." "I'll be sure to stay in the background, Father," she said softly, "right where I can see everything." Beatrice lingered for a second as the men walked out, her gaze darting toward the silver tablet in Cassandra's lap. "Just don't ruin this for us, Cass," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Marcus is our future. You need to accept that." "I've accepted exactly what Marcus is, Beatrice. I just hope you can do the same when the lights go up." As they left, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic, sharp click of a polishing cloth. Mrs. Gable was in the foyer, meticulously cleaning the Thorne family crest on the silver tray. The housekeeper looked up, her eyes meeting Cassandra's through the open door. There was no pity in the older woman's gaze, only a grim, knowing nod. She had seen Marcus's hands in the safe. She had heard the late-night calls. She was the witness who knew that the sleeping lion was finally awake. Cassandra stood, the tablet sliding into her bag with a satisfying click. She felt the cold, hard weight of the encrypted drive in her pocket, the digital guillotine she had spent months sharpening. The gala was 3 hours away. The witnesses were invited. The stage was set. As she walked toward the stairs to dress for the occasion, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a judge. Marcus Sterling thought he was walking into his greatest triumph, but Cassandra knew the truth. He was walking into a room full of people who were about to watch him lose everything. And he was the one who had handed her the match to light the fire. The evening of the Unity Gala arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thorne estate's grand ballroom. Cassandra Thorne stood at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at the sea of silk and tuxedos. The scent of 5,000 imported lilies hung heavy in the air, cloying and sweet, like a funeral for a man who didn't know he was dead yet. She adjusted the strap of her midnight blue gown, her fingers brushing against the small, hard rectangle of the encrypted drive tucked into her satin clutch. It felt like a live wire against her palm. At the center of the room, Marcus Sterling was holding court. He looked every bit the golden boy, his tailored tuxedo hugging shoulders that had never known the weight of honest labor. He was laughing, a loud, performative sound that carried over the soft hum of the string quartet. In his hand, he gripped a glass of vintage crystal, the gold of his heavy watch catching the light every time he gestured. He was surrounded by the Thorne board members, men who smelled of expensive tobacco and blind trust. Cassandra descended the stairs, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic count against the stone. She didn't look like the sleeping lion Marcus had spent months mocking. She looked like a ghost in her own home. "Ah, Cassandra," Marcus called out as she approached the circle. His eyes swept over her, dismissed her simple jewelry, and returned to the board members with a smirk. "Look at her. Even at her own family's gala, she looks like she's ready to go over a tax return. You really should learn to live a little, Cass. Life is for the bold, not the bean counters." A few of the younger associates chuckled. Arthur Thorne, standing at Marcus's shoulder, nodded in agreement. Her father's face was flushed with wine and pride, his hand resting on the shoulder of the man who was systematically draining his legacy. "The firm needs a steady hand, Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice a calm, flat line. "Not just a bold one." "Steady is another word for stagnant," Marcus countered, winking at Beatrice Thorne as she joined them. Beatrice was draped in diamonds that Cassandra knew had been purchased with a consulting fee Marcus had siphoned from the estate's maintenance fund. "Don't worry, darling. Once the merger is announced tonight, you can retire to some quiet library and never have to worry about a balance sheet again. I've taken care of everything." The arrogance in his voice was a physical weight. He wasn't just stealing their money, he was gloating about the ease of the theft. Cassandra felt a surge of cold fury, but she channeled it into a thin, knowing smile. She reached into her bag, her thumb tracing the edge of the drive. "I'm sure you have," she murmured. She caught the eye of Leo Vance, who was stationed near the tech booth at the far end of the ballroom. He looked like just another hired hand in his black vest, but the subtle tap he gave to his earpiece told her everything she needed to know. The gala's commemorative slideshow had been intercepted. The triumphant presentation Marcus had prepared, a series of doctored growth charts and false projections, was no longer the only file in the queue. Cassandra moved through the crowd, a silent observer in the house of her ancestors. She saw Mrs. Gable standing near the buffet, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but the housekeeper's eyes followed Marcus with a predatory stillness. The woman had already delivered the physical ledger to the safe house. Now, she was just waiting for the fire to start. "You look tense, sister," Beatrice whispered, sliding up beside her with a flute of champagne. "Try to be happy for once. Marcus is saving us. Dad hasn't been this energized in years. If you ruin this night with your gloom, I'll never forgive you." "I'm not gloomy, Beatrice," Cassandra said, watching Marcus lead Arthur toward the small stage at the front of the room. "I'm focused. There's a difference." "Whatever, just stay out of the way when the press arrives. Marcus wants this to be perfect." The lights in the ballroom began to dim, a signal that the formal presentation was beginning. The chatter of the 300 guests died down to a respectful murmur. Marcus stepped onto the podium, the spotlight hitting him with surgical precision. He looked magnificent, a lion in his prime, standing before the pride he had conquered. Behind him, a massive high-definition screen glowed white, waiting for the signal. The CFO, the primary shareholders, and the city's most influential journalists moved toward the front, their faces illuminated by the screen's pale glare. Marcus leaned into the microphone, his smile radiating enough charm to mask the rot beneath. "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the board and my dear Thorne family," he began, his voice booming with practiced confidence. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the history of this great institution. We celebrate its rebirth. For months, I've been working in the shadows to secure a future that will make the Thorne name synonymous with the new global economy." He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze landing on Cassandra. He raised his glass to her, a final mocking salute before the killing blow. "Some said we were too traditional, some said we were too slow. But as of tonight, I am proud to reveal the true scale of our success." He gestured to the technician in the back. "If we could have the first slide, please." Cassandra stood perfectly still in the shadows of a velvet curtain. She felt the vibration of her phone in her clutch, a single text from Leo. "Upload complete. All yours." Marcus turned toward the screen, his chest puffed out, ready to bask in the projected lies of his record-breaking quarter. He didn't see the flicker of the screen as the file path changed. He didn't see the way the board members' expressions shifted from anticipation to confused squinting as the first image appeared. It wasn't a growth chart. It was a scanned copy of a wire transfer to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, dated 3 weeks ago, with Marcus's digital signature glowing in the center of the frame. Marcus began to speak, his back still to the screen. "As you can see from our initial projections," he stopped. The room hadn't erupted in applause. It had gone deathly, unnervingly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector and the sharp, indrawn breath of Auditor Thorne, who was staring at the screen as if he were seeing a ghost. Cassandra stepped out of the shadows, her eyes locked on the back of Marcus's head. The wait-for-it moment had arrived. The fuse was lit, and the man at the podium was still holding the match. "Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I think you're showing the wrong presentation." Marcus turned, his smug smile still frozen on his face, and for the first time he looked at the screen behind him. Marcus Sterling didn't move. He stood frozen at the head of the boardroom table, the remote for the projector still clutched in a hand that had begun to tremble with a fine, rhythmic tremor. The silence that followed Cassandra's interruption was no longer the respectful hush of an audience. It was heavy, suffocating, and punctuated only by the mechanical, low-frequency whir of the cooling fan behind him. On the massive screen, the evidence of his $3 million consulting fee to a shell company remained bright, unyielding, and damning. Marcus's face underwent a violent, almost tectonic transformation. The arrogant, practiced mask of the rising executive disintegrated in real time, leaving behind something raw, panicked, and utterly pathetic. The healthy, sun-kissed glow he'd cultivated on weekend yacht trips seemed to evaporate, replaced by a translucent, waxy pallor that made his skin look like damp parchment. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for oxygen in a drying pond, but no sound emerged. Only a faint, wet clicking in the back of his throat that signaled the total collapse of his composure. His eyes, usually so focused on the next mark, were fixed on his own digital signature, darting back and forth as if he could physically pull the ink off the screen with his gaze. A single, heavy bead of perspiration rolled down his temple, carving a jagged path through his expensive bronzer and dripping onto the silk lapel of his $3,000 suit. "It's a mistake," he finally croaked, his voice cracking like dry wood. He turned toward the head of the table, his gaze pleading and frantic. "Arthur, you know me, this is a fabrication, a glitch in the presentation software." Auditor Thorne didn't look like a man who believed in glitches. He sat perfectly still, his large hands flat on the mahogany surface, the wood creaking under the sudden, immense pressure of his weight. The patriarch's eyes were narrowed into slits of cold steel, his jaw set so tightly that the muscles in his neck pulsed with every shallow breath. He didn't speak, but the way he looked at Marcus was the look a judge gives a man already standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. To his left, Beatrice Thorne let out a strangled sound, half gasp and half sob. She stared at Marcus as if he were a stranger she'd accidentally invited into her home. The diamond tennis bracelet he'd given her for her birthday, likely bought with the very funds currently glowing on the screen, seemed to burn against her wrist. She pulled her chair back, the metal legs screeching sharply against the marble floor, creating a physical gap between them that spoke of a permanent, icy exile. "It's not a glitch, Marcus," Cassandra Thorne said. She stepped fully into the light of the projector, her posture effortless, her expression one of clinical detachment. She smelled of the rain she'd walked through earlier and the sharp, metallic scent of fresh ink. Leo Vance spent 48 hours tracing the hot points of that transfer. It didn't go to a vendor. It went to a private account in Grand Cayman, which was then used to pay off your gambling debts in Macau. Leo leaned against the doorframe, a faint, predatory smile playing on his lips as he tapped a final command into his tablet. Marcus scrambled, his hands slapping uselessly against the podium. "You've been spying on me. Arthur, she's been hacking the company. This is illegal. She's trying to sabotage the merger because she's jealous of my position. I'm not hacking, Cassandra replied, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, dangerous hum that vibrated in the quiet room. She reached into her leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table toward her father. I'm auditing. As the majority shareholder of Thorne Holdings, I have every legal right to see where my money is going. The room went from silent to vacuum-sealed. Arthur's head snapped up, his brow furrowed in genuine shock. From the back of the room, near the heavy oak doors, Mrs. Gable stood tall, her eyes bright with a justice long overdue as she watched the man who had treated her like dirt begin to crumble. Majority, Marcus whispered, his knees visibly buckling. That's impossible. Arthur owns the controlling interest. Arthur owns 40%, Cassandra corrected, her gaze never wavering from Marcus's sweating face. He sold the other 20 to an anonymous trust 5 years ago to cover the textile expansion. I am that trust. I've been watching you bleed this company dry for 18 months, Marcus, just waiting for you to get arrogant enough to leave a digital footprint. Marcus reached out, perhaps to grab the screen or perhaps to steady himself, but his hand only found empty air. He looked small. For the first time, the expensive suit and the rehearsed bravado were gone, leaving only a middle-aged fraud in a room full of people who finally saw him for exactly what he was. Cassandra didn't wait for his apology. She didn't need his excuses. She turned toward the door, the cold, rhythmic click of her heels echoing like a countdown against the marble. Security is waiting in the lobby, Marcus. Don't bother going back to your office. Your personal effects have already been moved to the curb in trash bags. She paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder with a look of pure, frozen indifference. You once told me I didn't have the stomach for the family business. It turns out, I just didn't have the stomach for you. She walked out, leaving the boardroom door wide open for the security team already marching down the hall. Marcus Sterling's voice shattered the stunned quiet of the boardroom, a high, reedy sound that bore no resemblance to his usual practiced baritone. He was on his feet, his chair skidding back against the polished marble with a screech that set every nerve in the room on edge. He looked toward the open door where Cassandra had just vanished, his chest heaving under the fabric of a $3,000 suit that suddenly seemed 3 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. This is a fabrication, he shouted, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger at the glowing projector screen. She's unstable. Arthur, you know her. She's always been jealous of my position. She's doctored these logs. It's a digital hit job. Arthur Thorne didn't move. The patriarch sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of weathered granite. His eyes weren't on the screen anymore. They were fixed on the man he had once treated like a son. The silence from the board members was absolute, a vacuum that Marcus was desperately trying to fill with the frantic noise of a cornered animal. Beatrice, tell them. Marcus turned toward his wife, his eyes wild. Tell them she's been planning this. She's been trying to tear us apart for years. Beatrice Thorne didn't look up. She was staring at a physical ledger that Mrs. Gable had placed on the table moments before the security team arrived. It was a small, leather-bound book, Marcus's private shadow accounts, recovered from the floorboards of the guest house. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers twisting the pearls Arthur had given her for her last birthday. When she finally looked at her husband, her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. I saw the signature, Marcus, she whispered. That's your handwriting. You didn't just steal from the company. You emptied the trust for our children. The scent of ozone from the overworked projector hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of the security guards' equipment as they stepped into the room. Marcus backed away, his heels hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus's face underwent a violent, rhythmic transformation as the reality of his situation finally breached his defenses. The ruddy flush of his earlier indignation drained away with terrifying speed, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray that made his skin look like wet parchment stretched over bone. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip caught in a pathetic, silent tremor that he couldn't suppress. The sweat began as a fine sheen on his forehead before fat. Heavy beads broke and tracked through his expensive foundation, carving pale, muddy lines down his cheeks. His eyes, once sharp with predatory intent, darted frantically around the room, blown wide and glassy, unable to find a single friendly face to anchor his lies. He looked less like a man and more like a building collapsing in slow motion, the structural integrity of his ego shattered beyond repair. Leo Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the corner, holding a sleek black tablet. The encryption wasn't as sophisticated as you thought, Marcus. You used the same backdoor for the embezzlement that you used to hide your offshore gambling debts. I've already forwarded the decrypted server logs to the district attorney's office. They've been watching the data transfer in real time for the last 20 minutes. You can't do this, Marcus wheezed, his back pressed hard against the glass. I built this division. I made this family millions. You bled this family dry, Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the room. He stood slowly, the weight of his authority settling over the boardroom like a shroud. You mistook my patience for blindness, Marcus. You thought because I valued strength, I wouldn't recognize a thief in a silk tie. Arthur turned his gaze toward the door where Cassandra Thorne had reappeared. She stood in the threshold, her arms crossed, her expression one of frozen, clinical indifference. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She didn't even look like a sister or a daughter. She looked like the auditor of his soul. "The police are in the lobby, Arthur," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "They have the warrants for the house and the private vault." Marcus made a sudden, desperate move toward the side exit, but the lead security officer was faster. The sound of the struggle was brief. The thud of a body hitting the table, the sharp, rhythmic click of steel handcuffs, and the heavy grunt of a man who had finally run out of room to run. "Cassandra, wait," Beatrice sobbed, stepping toward her sister. "I didn't know, I swear I didn't know he was doing this to us." Cassandra looked at her sister, then at her father. She felt the cold weight of the evidence folder in her hand, a burden she had carried for 5 years while they mocked her for her paranoia and her lack of ambition. The victory didn't feel like a warm glow. It felt like the settling of a long-overdue debt. "You chose not to know, Beatrice," Cassandra said. She looked at Marcus as the guards hauled him toward the door. He was weeping now, a messy, undignified sound that filled the prestigious hall. "You once told me I didn't belong at this table because I didn't have the Thorne blood. It turns out you were right. I'm the only one in this room who actually protected it." She didn't wait for Arthur to speak. She didn't need his validation or his belated apologies. She turned and walked toward the elevators, the sound of her heels echoing with a final, decisive rhythm against the marble. Behind her, the empire she had saved was silent, and the man who had tried to steal it was being led away in shame. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the garage, leaving the wreckage of the Thorne legacy to be sorted by the lawyers and the police. For the first time in her life, the air felt clean. 6 months had passed since the marble halls of the Thorne Empire last echoed with Cassandra Thorne's footsteps. Today, the air she breathed was different, crisp, clean, and entirely her own. She sat in a corner office that didn't rely on a family crest to command respect. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city looked less like a chessboard and more like a landscape of possibilities. Leo Vance tapped on the open glass door, holding 2 cups of coffee. He didn't wait for an invitation. Their partnership had been forged in the fires of the Thorne collapse, and he had been the first person she hired when she launched her own forensic firm. He set a latte down on her desk, the steam rising in a gentle swirl that smelled of expensive roasted beans and success. "The final audit on the Thorne estate just cleared," Leo said, his voice lacking its usual tech-heavy jargon. He looked at her with a quiet sort of pride. "Arthur had to sell the Southampton property to cover the litigation costs Marcus left behind. Beatrice is living in a 2-bedroom condo in the city. She's adjusting." Cassandra took a slow sip of her coffee. The bitterness was familiar, but it didn't sting anymore. She thought of Beatrice Thorne, who had once mocked her for wearing off-the-rack suits, now forced to navigate a life without a fleet of staff to catch her every fall. It wasn't the ending Cassandra had dreamed of years ago, but it was the one they had earned. "And him," Cassandra asked. Leo handed her a tablet. He's waiting. You don't have to go, you know. The lawyers can handle the final signature. I know, she replied, standing up and smoothing the front of her navy silk blazer. But some debts need to be closed in person. The drive to the state correctional facility took 2 hours, a journey through changing scenery that felt like a metaphor for the last half year of her life. The smell of the countryside faded, replaced by the sterile, oppressive scent of industrial bleach and stale air as she stepped through the security scanners. The metallic clank of the sliding gates was a harsh, rhythmic reminder of where Marcus Sterling now belonged. She was led into a small, windowless visiting room. The fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating, high-pitched buzz that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. When the door on the opposite side opened, the man who walked in was a ghost of the predator who had once stalked the Thorne boardroom. Marcus had lost weight, his skin sallow under the harsh lights. The expensive Italian wool suits had been replaced by a coarse, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his frame. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and dull. He sat down heavily, the plastic chair screeching against the linoleum floor. "You look like hell, Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice calm and devoid of the rage that used to fuel her. He let out a dry, raspy laugh that turned into a cough. "And you look like you've stepped off the cover of a magazine. Come to gloat. Come to see the trash in its proper bin." "I came to finish the paperwork," she said, sliding a single document across the table. "This is the formal relinquishment of your remaining offshore interests. They've been seized by the court, but your signature speeds up the restitution for the employees you robbed." Marcus stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. The entitlement that had once been his armor was gone, leaving only a bitter, hollow shell. "Arthur won't even take my calls. Beatrice sent a letter telling me never to contact her again. They're my family, Cassandra. They were your marks, Marcus. You just didn't realize it until the money ran out." He looked up at her, a flash of the old malice flickering in his eyes. "You think you won. You broke that family. You tore it apart just to prove a point." Cassandra leaned forward, the scent of her perfume, a subtle, sophisticated jasmine cutting through the smell of bleach. "I didn't break the family. I just stopped holding the pieces together while you kicked them. Arthur chose his pride over the truth, and Beatrice chose a lie over her sister. I'm just the one who stopped paying for the privilege of being their victim." Marcus grabbed the pen, scrawling his name with a jagged, desperate motion. He shoved the paper back toward her. "Get out. Go back to your shiny new office and your perfect life." "I intend to," she said, standing up. As she walked toward the door, she paused. She looked back at the man who had tried to erase her, now reduced to a number in a system that didn't care about his pedigree or his charm. The empty chair beside him seemed to represent everything he had lost: status, power, and the people he had manipulated. The sun was setting when she stepped back outside, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep golds. She felt the weight of the last 6 months, the loss of a sister, the silence of a father, and the death of the girl she used to be. It was a high price for justice, a cost measured in broken ties and lonely evenings. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool, solid weight of her new office key. She had saved the Thorne empire, but in the end, she had walked away from it to build something real. She stepped into her car and started the engine, leaving the shadows of the prison behind. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Cassandra knew exactly where she was going.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.